Picture the man at your gym who drives a Honda Accord with 140,000 miles on it, wears the same 3 shirts on rotation, and once mentioned in passing that he paid cash for his house in 2011. Now picture your coworker who leases a new BMW every 3 years, posts every vacation, and just financed a $4,000 watch to celebrate a promotion. If someone asked you to guess which one has more money, you would probably guess wrong. Not slightly wrong, statistically, reliably wrong, in a way that has been measured, replicated, and documented for decades. The signals you were trained to read as wealth are not just imperfect. In most cases, they are inverted, and the reason they are inverted is not an accident of human psychology. It is the output of a system that profits every time you misread the signal. I'm going to show you exactly how that system was built and why it needed you to keep guessing wrong. For most of your life, the belief has worked well enough to feel like common sense. A nice car means someone can afford a nice car. A big house in a good school district means someone earns enough to carry the mortgage. Designer labels, first-class seats, a Rolex on the wrist during a client dinner, these are legible signs, and legibility is comforting. It lets you sort the world quickly. You do not need a stranger's tax return to guess whether they are doing well. You just look. This shorthand is not irrational. It evolved because, for most of human history, visible consumption actually did track resources. A herd of cattle, a stone house, a set of gold rings, these things were expensive to fake and expensive to acquire. So the display and the substance moved together for thousands of years. The belief that appearance predicts affluence is not a modern delusion. It is an old, useful heuristic that once had a tight correlation with reality. And every advertisement, every financing plan, every aspirational caption you have ever scrolled past is quietly leaning on the fact that some part of you still trusts that correlation. You use it to judge clients, in-laws, potential partners, even yourself. If your house looks successful, some part of you feels successful, regardless of what the mortgage statement actually says. That feeling is not stupidity. It is inherited pattern recognition, running on data that stopped being reliable a long time ago. And because the heuristic still feels true in the moment, it rarely gets audited, so it keeps making the same comparisons on your behalf every time you size yourself up against someone else. Here is the crack. In the early 1990s, researchers Thomas Stanley and William Danko spent nearly 20 years surveying more than 1,000 American households with a net worth over $1 million, and the results did not match the shorthand at all. The prototypical millionaire in their data was not driving a new luxury car. Most drove domestic, non-luxury vehicles, often several years old, and a large share had never spent more than the price of a modest new car on any vehicle in their life. They lived in the same middle-class neighborhoods for decades, outnumbered roughly 3-to-1 by neighbors who were not millionaires. Only about 1% had ever bought a pair of shoes priced above $600. Meanwhile, the households burning the most on visible goods relative to their income were often not the wealthy at all, but people using debt to manufacture the appearance of for an audience that would never see their actual balance sheet. The uncomfortable part is not that some rich people happen to be frugal. Individual exceptions do not threaten a belief. The uncomfortable part is that the study found this pattern to be the rule, not the exception, across a large, representative sample, meaning that for decades, most people have been using the wrong instrument to measure the thing they were trying to measure, and getting confidently wrong answers as a result. The pattern shows up again more recently, in an unexpected place. Starting around 2023, a trend called quiet luxury became a dominant story in high net worth marketing circles, built entirely around removing logos, muting colors, and making expensive items look deliberately unremarkable. The people driving that trend were not doing it by accident. We're responding to the same discomfort you may be starting to feel right now, that visible spending had become a liability rather than an asset, because too many people without money had learned to copy the look. If the wealthy are quietly redesigning their own signals to stop being read correctly, That tells you something important about how broken the old signal already was. The mechanism has a name, and economists have been studying it since before your grandparents were born. It is called conspicuous consumption, a term coined in 1899 by the economist Thorstein Veblen, who observed that in an industrial society, wealth had become too abstract to see directly, so people began spending specifically to make it visible. You cannot inspect someone's bank balance at a dinner party. You can inspect their shoes. Veblen's insight was that once wealth becomes invisible by default, spending stops being only about using resources and starts being about proving you have them, which means the spending itself becomes the product, separate from whatever object it happens to be attached to. For most of the 20th century, that signal stayed relatively expensive to fake because credit was harder to get and manufacturing costs kept luxury goods scarce. What changed the mechanism from an occasional social ritual into a structural feature of the economy was the arrival of accessible consumer debt. Once financing, leasing, and revolving credit became available to almost anyone with a job, the cost of faking the signal collapsed. You no longer needed the money to display the money. You only needed a credit line, a monthly payment, and a willingness to carry it. Auto leasing let a person earning $60,000 drive the same car as someone earning $400,000. Store financing let a modest income buy a status wardrobe on installments. The signal and the substance, which Veblen assumed traveled together, were formally and permanently decoupled, and an entire financing industry grew up specifically to profit from that decoupling, collecting interest from people spending money not have in order to look like they had money they did not have. The current form of the mechanism is more precise than simple status envy, and understanding the precision matters. In 2009, the economists Kerwin Kofi Charles, Eric Hurst, and Nikolai Rusinov published research showing that visible consumption is not calibrated against wealth in the abstract. It is calibrated against a specific reference group, the people you actually compare yourself to, your neighborhood, your coworkers, your social feed. Their model predicted, and the data confirmed, that visible spending declines as the average income of a person's reference group rises, because the less the people around you have, the more effective a given dollar of visible spending becomes at establishing your relative position within that group. This means the entire apparatus was never really designed to signal wealth in general. It is designed to signal relative position within a specific, local comparison, which is exactly why moving to a wealthier neighborhood or a higher-earning peer group so often triggers a fresh wave of spending. You have not necessarily gotten richer. Your reference group has, and the signal has to recalibrate to keep functioning. 3 industries profit directly from this mechanism operating correctly, and none of them profit if you stop performing. The consumer finance industry profits from the loans, leases, and revolving balances that let the signal outrun the substance. The luxury and fashion industry profits from a constant redesign of what counts as the current signal, which is why status goods lose relevance almost as fast as they lose resale value. Last year's marker still worked. No one would need to buy a new one. And increasingly, social platforms profit from the visibility itself, because a photographed vacation, a tagged handbag, and a captioned car all generate engagement the platform monetizes regardless of whether the underlying asset is owned, financed, or simply borrowed for the shot. None of these 3 industries needs you to be wealthy. They need you to keep spending in a way that looks like wealth. And the 2 behaviors are not the same thing, even though your nervous system was trained since childhood to treat them as identical. There is a second-order effect worth naming before moving on, because it explains why the mechanism survives every attempt to expose it. Once a critical mass of people learn that visible spending does not reliably indicate wealth, the rational response is not to abandon the signal. It is to escalate it, because a diluted signal has to get louder or more expensive to keep doing its job. This is why status goods in every era eventually price themselves out of the middle of the market and re-anchor higher, why the entry-level luxury handbag of a decade ago is now considered a starter item, and why each generation's version of a status car costs meaningfully more, in real terms, than the one before it. The signal is not becoming more accurate. It is becoming more expensive to fake, which briefly restores some of its usefulness, right up until financing catches up again and the cycle repeats. Nobody is coordinating this centrally. It emerges automatically from an industry of independent actors, each one profiting from keeping the signal just barely out of reach of whoever most wants to display it. Plant this now, because it matters later. Once quiet luxury, minimalism, and the rejection of logos became fashionable in their own right, the absence of a visible signal became a new visible signal, priced accordingly, and marketed to exactly the audience that could afford to pay a premium for looking like they were not performing at all. You may remember Nina from episode 13. She was 44 then, a radiologist earning $310,000 a year, with a take-home of $17,500 a month after tax and deductions. Her fixed costs ran $15,000 a month, a mortgage payment of $6,200 on a $950,000 loan at 6.8% over 30 years, $1,000 in property tax and maintenance, $2,800 in malpractice insurance, and $5,000 going into retirement accounts. That left a discretionary margin of $2,500 a month and an emotional state we called trapped competence, the specific exhaustion of being extremely good at something extremely well compensated and still not free. The question in episode 13 was whether Nina could afford to stop. This time, the question is different, and it is the one that actually determines her future. What is the compounding cost of not stopping? To anyone looking at Nina from the outside, every visible signal reads as success. The house, the neighborhood, the title on her badge, the fact that she can walk into any restaurant in her city without thinking about the bill. By every heuristic covered so far in this episode, Nina looks like exactly the kind of person the man on the modest salary is supposed to envy. But run the arithmetic forward instead of reading the surface. $2,500 a month, invested at a conservative 7% average return, compounds to roughly $43,000 after 10 years of monthly contributions, not counting whatever raises might widen that margin over time. That is not nothing. But compare it to what her fixed costs are actually buying. The $6,200 mortgage payment is mostly interest in these early years at 6.8%, meaning a large share of every payment builds her lender's balance sheet, not her own equity. The malpractice premium and the size of the house both exist because of the income and the title, not despite them. A smaller, quieter version of Nina's life would require a smaller policy, a smaller loan, and a lower monthly floor, freeing several $1,000s a month that currently goes toward maintaining a visible standard of living nobody, but Nina is actually required to maintain. Here is the reframe episode 13 did not have the numbers to make yet. Every year, Nina keeps this configuration, the version of wealth that would let her stop, work part-time, or change specialties without a financial emergency gets structurally further away, not closer, because almost the entire margin her income generates is consumed by the fixed costs off, looking like someone earning $310,000 a year is supposed to look. Her income is loud. It has a mortgage attached to it, a malpractice premium attached to it, a specific house in a specific zip code attached to it, and every one of those attachments requires her to keep earning at the same level indefinitely just to service it. A colleague of hers, earning less, in a smaller house with no lease and no premium wardrobe, could be quietly outpacing her in real liquid, unencumbered net worth within a decade, without a single visible marker to prove it. Nina has not made a decision yet. She has not downsized the house, changed the mortgage, or reduced the insurance load. What has changed is the question she is now asking herself at night, replacing "can I afford to stop" with a colder one. What, exactly, is all of this visible success actually costing her every single month in the invisible kind of wealth she has never gotten around to building? Nina's situation is not unusual for her profession, and the scale confirms the mechanism rather than complicating it. According to Medscape's most recent physician wealth survey, roughly 60% of physician families now report a net worth of $1 million or more, and the share reporting $5 million or more has been rising for 3 consecutive years. On paper, medicine looks like one of the most reliable paths in the country toward that kind of number. But the same body of research shows most physicians begin their attending careers with $200,000 to $400,000 in student debt, meaning a doctor who finishes residency at 30 with a negative net worth of roughly $280,000 does not cross back to zero until somewhere in their mid-30s, years after friends in other careers already had a positive, if modest, balance sheet. The income arrives loud and immediate. The wealth arrives late, if the spending pattern allows it to arrive at all. Scale that same structure up to the wider high-income population, hypothetically, and the picture holds. Lawyers at large firms, corporate executives with expense account lifestyles, employees holding equity that has not vested yet, all occupy the same category as Nina, high income that generates a high cost of maintaining the appearance of high income, in a specific zip code, car class, and social tier that resets upward every time their reference group changes. The mechanism scales precisely because it is not really about any one profession. It is about what happens whenever income outpaces the visible signals a person is expected to display at that income level, and whether the gap between the two gets converted into unencumbered assets or absorbed into fixed costs that require the income to continue forever. This is where the reference group research becomes structurally important rather than just interesting. If visible spending recalibrates against your immediate peer group rather than against wealth in the abstract, then every promotion, every new neighborhood, every higher-earning friend group quietly resets the baseline and, with it, the spending required to feel like you belong there. A person whose income never changes can stay comfortably invisible their entire life. A person whose income rises has to actively resist an automatic recalibration that happens by default because the reference group moves whether or not the person consciously chooses to follow it. Nobody sends a notice. The new baseline simply becomes normal, the way Nina's mortgage became normal, the way trapped competence became normal, until an episode like this one names it out loud. Hypothetically, if you mapped this across an entire high-earning generation rather than one radiologist, the aggregate effect would not show up as an obvious crisis. It would show up as a quiet divergence, a growing distance between reported household income, which keeps rising, and reported household liquidity, which does not rise nearly as fast, spread across millions of families who each look, individually, like they are doing fine. No single year would look alarming. The gap compounds too slowly for any one data point to feel urgent, which is precisely the condition under which a structural mechanism gets to keep operating for decades without anyone treating it as the emergency it actually is. Redefine the term now, because the version you started this episode with was never accurate. Wealth was never the presence of nice things. It is not quite the absence of financial noise either, though that gets closer. Wealth is the condition of not needing your finances to be legible to anyone else, including yourself in a moment of doubt. The millionaire in the modest car is not hiding money. He simply has nothing left to prove to a reference group he stopped needing decades ago. His net worth does not require an audience to be real. This is where quiet luxury exposes itself as something other than an escape from the mechanism. A $2,000 cashmere sweater with no visible logo is still a $2,000 sweater purchased specifically because the right people will recognize the brand, the cut, and the price without needing to see a label. It did not remove the performance. It moved the performance to a smaller, more expensive, more exclusive stage, readable only to an audience wealthy enough to already know the code. That is not the absence of financial noise. That is financial noise pitched at a frequency only certain people can hear, and it still requires an audience, which means it still requires performance, which means it is still the same mechanism, wearing a quieter uniform. Actual invisible wealth does not need the audience at all, coded or otherwise. It looks from the outside exactly like nothing because it was never built to be looked at. It is the used car paid off in full, the mortgage from 2011 at 4% instead of the one Nina is carrying at 6.8, the retirement account that has been receiving the same unglamorous percentage every month for 15 years without anyone in the room ever knowing the balance. None of it photographs well. None of it is designed to. The entire point of it is that it functions exactly the same whether anyone is watching or not, which is the actual test that separates wealth from the performance of wealth. Does it survive the complete absence of an audience? By that test, Nina's mortgage fails, not because $6,200 a month is irrational, but because the house it buys was priced, at least in part, by what a radiologist is supposed to be able to afford, not only by what Nina actually needs. And by that same test, the wealthiest people you will ever meet are the ones you already failed to notice, because you were trained your whole life to look for the signal instead of the substance. And the signal, as it turns out, was never actually pointing at the thing you thought it was. The wealthiest people you will ever meet spent years looking like nobody. Think about the last time you assumed someone was successful based on what they owned. What would you have guessed about them if you could not see any of it? But invisibility is not the same as ignorance. There is a difference between wealth that chose not to perform and wealth that was never taught how to exist in the first place. Next, we look at who decided what you would be taught about money and why the lesson stopped exactly where it needed to keep going.